Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Bethesda, Maryland, March 11th, 2011. A premium athleisure store closes its doors for the night, as it had countless times before. But by the next sunrise, the same storefront is locked down by police tape. Inside, officers uncover a scene that shocks a quiet community. One employee, Jana Murray, a 30-year-old manager, is dead. Another, a fellow coworker, is found bound, cut, and claiming masked men had broken in. What begins as a possible robbery quickly turns into one of the most unsettling workplace crimes in recent memory. The first hours matter. Shortly after dawn on March 12th, the store's manager arrives for the morning shift. Expecting silence, she unlocks the door and steps directly into chaos. Displays askew, traces of struggle, and faint signs that something had gone very wrong. Within moments, she retreats and calls 911. Patrol cars converge within minutes. Medics step inside and locate two employees, Jana in the back, beyond saving, and her colleague lying restrained, speaking through shallow breaths about intruders who had forced their way in after closing. Officers do what protocol demands: secure the perimeter, restrict movement, and begin logging the scene. Every footprint, every door, every drawer is photographed. Cash registers are checked. Money is still there. Merchandise is untouched. Doors show no sign of being forced. These observations aren't minor, they're contradictions. In cases of violent retail invasion, forced entry and theft are usually the anchors. Here, both are absent. The quiet anomalies stand out. Blood patterns limited to the store interior, shoe impressions large enough to suggest a male but traced back to footwear sold off the shelf. Bindings on the survivor that appear inconsistent with an outside attacker. Each of these details is cataloged, not yet judged, because early assumptions can corrode an investigation. By mid-morning, detectives expand their search beyond the storefront. Jana's vehicle isn't where coworkers expect it to be. Instead, it's discovered only a few blocks away, parked neatly, not stripped, not abandoned in panic. Its placement raises more questions than it answers. In Bethesda, violent crime at this scale is rare. That rarity sharpens the focus. Neighbors recall muffled sounds late at night, dragging, a woman pleading, but no rush of masked men, no vehicles tearing off into the dark. The data points don't align with the survivor's claim, but investigators hold back. Procedure comes first: secure the evidence, record the scene, preserve the chain. As Jana Murray's name is confirmed and notifications are made to her family, the weight of the case becomes personal. She is not just another statistic. She is a daughter, a partner, a colleague. Investigators know their responsibility is both forensic and human. When patrol units pulled back from their initial sweep, detectives and forensic technicians stepped inside the Lululemon store with fresh eyes. The crime scene itself had to be treated not as a story told by the survivor, but as a locked environment where every detail, position of objects, marks on surfaces, impressions on the floor, was its own witness. The interior revealed disruption that didn't quite add up. Clothing racks and displays were disturbed, but not in the frantic scatter typically left by fleeing robbers. High-value merchandise remained stacked neatly. Cash drawers held their deposits. There were no signs that a door had been forced or a window tampered with. What was presented as the aftermath of a violent invasion looked instead like something carefully staged. Investigators noted that silence, no missing items, no breach, no path of exit. The most critical discovery was in the back hallway. Jana Murray's body lay there, subjected to extreme violence. Multiple weapons had been used, tools and kitchen-grade implements found inside the store. This raised immediate procedural questions. Why would outside attackers improvise with items on hand rather than bring their own? Why leave behind so many incriminating objects? The brutality was undeniable, but its origin was inconsistent with the narrative of masked strangers. A second area drew scrutiny, where the surviving employee had been found restrained. The bindings and superficial wounds appeared inconsistent with the level of force used on Jana. Medical responders had already commented that the injuries looked shallow, more controlled than inflicted under pressure. Forensics backed that first impression. The tape was applied in a way that allowed some mobility, unlike true assault restraints. Every footprint on the floor was photographed. At first glance, several prints suggested male size. But when compared against stock on the shelves, technicians realized the impressions matched a popular line of store-brand sneakers. The crime scene itself held its own inventory, and it appeared someone had used it deliberately. This was not a random intrusion. It was staged from resources inside. The parking arrangement outside added to the puzzle. Jaina's vehicle had been relocated a short distance away, not stripped, not abandoned hastily. Its placement suggested intent to conceal, not the chaotic flight of robbers. In procedural terms, this was a working anomaly, something pointing toward internal manipulation rather than external assault. For the community, news spread quickly. Residents walking along Bethesda Avenue that morning saw the police tape and media vans. In towns like this, crime of this magnitude doesn't just shock, it fractures the sense of daily safety. People began asking, if strangers weren't responsible, what did that mean about who was? Detectives were cautious. The survivor's account had to be documented and tested against physical evidence. But even before interviews, the scene itself had spoken clearly. What was meant to look like invasion read more like orchestration. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Once the scene had been logged, investigators turned to the invisible record every modern crime leaves behind: data. In homicide investigations, the digital trail often matters as much as fingerprints. Access logs, phone records, and transaction histories provide an unaltered timeline that no staged environment can conceal. The Lululemon store had an electronic entry system. Every employee swipe was recorded, time-stamped, and retained. Analysts cross-checked these entries against surveillance timestamps from neighboring businesses. The logs confirmed that M.u.r.d.e.r and her colleague had closed the store together that evening. Hours later, activity on the system showed additional movement, entries that did not align with customer traffic and did not reflect any sign of an actual break-in. Cell phone data added another layer. Jana's calls stopped abruptly after closing, a detail consistent with the timeline of her death. The surviving employee's phone showed limited activity, texts, and brief calls, but the device remained within the coverage area of downtown Bethesda the entire night. Importantly, there was no evidence of unknown numbers tied to the alleged intruders. Investigators noted the absence: no strange contacts, no external coordination, no digital presence to support a robbery narrative. Financial records also came into play. The store's cash drawers and high-value merchandise inventory had not been disturbed. This detail stood in direct contrast to the story of armed thieves. Detectives obtained bank records for both employees. Jana's accounts reflected routine purchases and regular debit card use. The surviving employee's accounts showed overdrafts and recent large withdrawals. While financial stress is not proof of guilt, it was a working indicator of motive when paired with other anomalies. The deepest contradiction came from the employee's own statements. In interviews, she repeated that two masked men had forced them inside, assaulted them, and stolen nothing of value. Yet every digital record, swipe logs, phone data, financial ledgers contradicted the existence of outsiders. Instead, the crime looked increasingly contained within the store itself. For investigators, the digital and financial trail provided structure. The scene had been chaotic, but the data was linear. In procedural terms, it became a timeline that was resistant to manipulation. The evidence suggested premeditation and concealment rather than random intrusion. At this stage, law enforcement faced a critical question. If no intruders were present, how had this level of violence emerged from inside the store's own walls? In a homicide that unfolds inside a workplace, the people and policies of that workplace become as central as any lab test. The goal here was not to speculate about character. It was to anchor behavior to records. M.u.r.d.e.r wasn't a stranger to responsibility. She was 30, trusted by management, known for closing the store by the book. Her routine mattered because routine leaves a pattern, and patterns expose breaks. Loss prevention at this store was clear. Employees completed bag checks at the end of a shift, and concerns about shrink were documented through managers. In the days leading up to the violence, an internal concern surfaced about merchandise leaving the premises outside policy. It wasn't a dramatic subplot, it was a standard retail problem that had been elevated the right way. Manager looped in, follow-up expected. Investigators did not treat that note as a motive by itself. They treated it as a scheduled conversation that placed Jana and a colleague in the same tight window after closing, with a reason to revisit the store and finish paperwork. What happened next would be measured against that context. The human side of this case begins with Jana's reliability. Friends expected texts, Family expected calls. After closing, her digital footprint stopped. That silence was consistent with the medical examiner's early time of death estimate constructed from body temperature and environmental conditions, and with the building's quiet overnight profile. Lights on longer than usual, movement limited to interior corridors, no credible signs of forced re-entry from the street. Nothing in her history suggested she would abandon protocol or ignore safety once the doors were locked. She did not live like a risk-taker, and the building did not log outsider risk. Police canvassed the row of businesses that share walls with the store. The next-door Apple location was important because thin walls carry sound. Employees there reported a woman's voice pleading for help late at night and the dull thud of something heavy being dragged. No one reported hearing multiple male voices, no one saw masked men moving in and out, and no one found doors ajar on the block. Those statements were not treated as conclusive. They were treated as directional. They narrowed the focus from the street back to the space that held Jaina. Victimology also examines what a person was about to do. Jaina's life, by all accounts, was moving forward. Graduate study, a stable relationship, a near-term future organized around work and family. Investigators combed her calendar, email, and messages for signs of upheaval and found none relevant to that night beyond closing responsibilities and the standard end-of-shift procedures. When a victim's trajectory points to continuity and their communications cut off inside a locked building, law enforcement leans harder on the building's own story. Inside that story sat the colleague who survived. Her account remained that two masked men forced their way in, assaulted both employees, and left without stealing valuables. The statement was documented. The tone of the interview bears noting only because it was careful. Detectives did not challenge memory under medical stress. They froze the narrative and walked it back to the physical signs. Over the next hours, as statements were expanded, certain elements shifted. The order of blows, where the attackers first appeared, and the period of restraint. Meanwhile, the room's fixed details did not shift. The contrast between a fluid narrative and static facts set the stage for escalation analysis. Not who felt what, but what happened in which order. Escalation is a term often misused to suggest sudden rage. Here, escalation was defined by sequence and availability. Which implements were near which injuries, and when those implements likely came into play. The store supplied multiple tools on site, standard fixtures, small hardware, and blades kept for merchandise prep. The presence of varied implements inside a locked retail space, combined with the absence of outside instruments, suggested a violence that developed inside the walls rather than one imported from the street. That distinction isn't cosmetic. It speaks to opportunity and control. Someone moved freely enough within the store to access items as the incident progressed, and no evidence indicated a second scene beyond the retail footprint. The setting also forced detectives to consider candidly how conflict can harden fast in close quarters when policy is at stake. Retail enforcement of bag checks is mundane until it isn't. A conversation about policy can pivot from a write-up to panic, from panic to concealment. This is not an attempt to explain away an assault. It is an explanation of why, in quiet neighborhoods, violent crimes sometimes grow out of everyday rule enforcement with no warning to anyone outside the room. The human lesson is uncomfortable but useful. Small confrontations in closed spaces can create pressure that blinds people to outcomes they cannot undo. Back on the procedural side, the team layered that workplace context over the prior chapter's findings. No forced entry at the front or rear, no stolen cash or high-value merchandise. Footwear impressions consistent with in-store product. A vehicle moved a short distance in a way that looked more like stagecraft than flight. Now add victimology. A conscientious employee drawn back after hours for a reason grounded in policy, heard pleading through a shared wall with no corroboration of multiple male attackers. And add escalation analysis. A progression of force using what the room offered. The picture these strands formed was not cinematic. It was contained. The next step was not to infer motive beyond the available record. It was to formalize focus. Person of interest status is not a conviction. It is a practical tool that narrows interviews, subpoenas, and lab priorities. With the victim profile complete and the escalation model sketched, investigators identified which interviews to repeat, which digital requests to file, and which exhibits to rush. They needed the cleanest path from context to charge, if a charge would be supported at all. There was a brief pause to center Jaina as more than data. Families watching from the edge of a taped perimeter deserve clarity that is earned, not promised. A disciplined investigation protects the victim twice, once by not contaminating the case and again by not overstating what the evidence can prove. As the lead detective phrased it in briefing notes, the work from here had to keep one point straight. The crime was built by the room and the records, not by assumption. A contained scene, a fixed timeline, and a victim whose routine didn't invite strangers. Those were the anchors. To move from suspicion to a charge, detectives had to show how the physical record, the digital record, and the survivor's statements converged on a single, testable theory of the crime. The point wasn't drama. It was probable cause that would hold up in a Maryland courtroom. The interior reconstruction came first. Analysts mapped movement inside the store by working from what could be measured: transfer patterns, the location of implements kept for store use, and the placement of the surviving employee at discovery. That mapping did not produce an exit route to the street. Instead, it showed repeated motion within the retail footprint, back room to sales floor and back again. High-value items were still in place. Entry points were intact. The room read as controlled. Investigators matched the prominent footwear impressions to a men's line carried on the sales wall. And the sizing and tread were consistent with in-store stock rather than an unknown outsider's shoes. That finding didn't identify a person, but it identified method, a staged intruder path created with merchandise at hand. When evidence says the attackers borrowed their shoes from a display, the robbery story loses air. Next, vehicle handling. Jaina Murray's car had been moved a short distance and parked near the retail corridor. The move created the appearance of an escape that reached the street, but it didn't create the evidence of one. There were no forced entry marks on the vehicle, no smash and grab signs, no reckless abandon. Investigators documented that the keys tied to the vehicle were recovered with the surviving employee's effects. In charging practice, that detail is not a flourish. It is access plus opportunity, squarely inside the window when the store was already locked to the public. The survivor's account was preserved, then compared, line by line, to fixed facts. She described two masked men who forced their way back in, assaulted both employees, and left them bound. The building did not show forced access, neighboring businesses did not supply external actors, and nothing of value left the premises. Medical assessment of the survivor's injuries characterized them as superficial and compatible with self-application. The more the account was checked against things that don't change, doors, drawers, inventory, cameras from adjacent storefronts, the more the account failed to find support. Investigators then layered motive indicators without overstating them. Retail loss prevention policies had generated a recent documented concern about merchandise leaving the store. Jaina, the employee who closed by the book, had looped management in. That context explained why two coworkers were in the same after-hour space and why an uncomfortable conversation might have occurred. It did not prove intent by itself, and detectives were careful to keep that boundary clear. But in a charging affidavit, access, motive pressure, and consciousness of guilt can travel together, especially when the scene reads as staged. The medical examiner's work provided the severity frame without venturing into narration. A large number of injuries inflicted with implements sourced inside the store, evidence that the victim was alive during portions of the assault, and no medical findings to corroborate the survivor's claim of sexual assault by outsiders. The pathologist's role in a charging theory is to define mechanism and rule out phantom events. Here, that meant the violence escalated using tools at hand, and key elements of the masked intruder's account had no medical support. Legally, the elements for first-degree murder in Maryland, willful, deliberate, premeditated, can be satisfied by proof of planning as well as by proof of a concealment strategy that follows the act. Staging a scene, relocating a vehicle to suggest an outside escape, and delivering a detailed false report all go to consciousness of guilt. Each piece alone is not a case. Together, they can satisfy a prosecutor's burden for probable cause. Detectives conferred with the state's attorney's office to align the affidavit with those elements rather than stack summaries. The filing would highlight the lack of forced entry, the lack of theft, the in-store shoe print staging, the vehicle relocation via keys in the survivor's control, The disparity between injuries, neighbor testimony of a woman's pleas, and contradictions within the survivor's own statements. With that constellation assembled, the threshold was met. An arrest warrant issued, and the surviving coworker, Brittany Norwood, was taken into custody on account of first-degree murder. The theory was coherent and testable: an internal confrontation tied to policy, a lethal assault in a locked store, and a post-incident staging designed to redirect blame to fictional intruders. In towns like Bethesda, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet commercial street. But that same quiet provides predictable routines, and routines are hard to fake in the record. The procedural posture changed overnight. Interviews that had been voluntary became custodial. Search warrants expanded to capture clothing, devices, and any item that could connect the staging to a single actor. The vehicle underwent closer latent and trace processing. Lab priorities were set to reinforce the internal-only narrative the room had already told. Investigators avoided overreach. The affidavit did not claim motives that could not be substantiated. It listed the documented pressure point, loss prevention, and the observable outcomes: a homicide inside a locked business, a moved vehicle, and a false report. Charging is not a verdict. It is a formal statement that the evidence, viewed together, points strongly enough to send the case to a jury. The human cost stays present. Jana Murray's family learned that the case was no longer an open question, but a path to court. The community, watching a storefront wrapped in tape just off Bethesda Avenue, learned that the story was not two masked men fleeing into the night. It was something harder to accept: violence that grew out of a workplace and tried to disguise itself as random. The case that began inside a locked retail space moved into a Montgomery County courtroom with the same discipline: show what the room proved, match it to records that do not bend, and test every statement against fixed facts. Prosecutors led with sequence, not spectacle. They walked the jury through closing time, the after-hours return, and the discovery at dawn, then anchored each step to exhibits that would not change: access logs, photographs with scale, chain of custody forms, and the medical examiner's report. Jurors saw the store before they heard about anyone's intentions. They were shown the undisturbed entry points and the intact cash area. They were guided across the sales floor into the back corridor and through the inventory room where tools were kept for daily operations. The point was straightforward. Nothing about the shell of the building supported the claim that strangers forced their way in, took control, and left without taking anything. The space read as contained, and the evidence behaved that way. The footwear workup came next. A lab analyst described how class characteristics on the blood-tracked impressions aligned with a men's model sold on the wall of the store. It was not mystical, and it did not overpromise class, not individual, characteristics, but it did what the state needed it to do. It broke the robbery story's spine by showing the intruder's path could be made with store stock. Jurors looked at side-by-side photos, the outsole pattern in the print and the outsole pattern on the display shoe. A clean, teachable match of class features documented step by step. The medical examiner's testimony built the severity frame without dramatics. The findings established that Jana Murray suffered well over 300 distinct injuries caused by multiple implements available inside the store, and that she was alive for portions of the assault. There was no medical evidence to corroborate an outsider sexual assault. The doctor avoided conclusions about motive and stuck to mechanism, chronology, and negative findings. In a case where a story of masked men had to be dismantled, the absence of corroboration was nearly as important as the presence of trauma. Neighbor testimony from employees at the adjacent Apple store provided sound oversight. Late at night, they heard a woman pleading for help and the heavy drag of movement, but they did not see or hear multiple males moving in and out of the corridor. That didn't name a suspect. It narrowed the narrative window. Combined with the store's undisturbed access points, the testimony corralled the violence back inside the four walls that had to account for it. Vehicle handling was addressed with the same incremental logic. Jurors learned the victim's car was moved a short distance and parked neatly nearby, not crashed or dumped. They learned where the keys were found in the effects of the surviving employee. Prosecutors did not inflate that detail. They used it to show access and time in the aftermath, consistent with staging rather than flight. In towns like Bethesda, routine is the baseline. A car out of place by a few blocks inside a quiet retail grid is not background. It is an event to be explained. Then came the survivors' statements. The jury heard the initial account of two masked men, overnight captivity, and a violent escape. They also heard how key pieces of that account shifted across interviews, the order of events, where attackers supposedly first appeared, and how long restraints were applied, while fixed elements in the room did not shift. Cross-examination stayed on the rails. No character attacks, just a line-by-line comparison to the parts of the case that are not subject to memory. When a narrative evolves and the doors, drawers, and devices do not, jurors are given a clear choice about which set of facts to trust. The defense worked to narrow the charge, suggesting loss of control and attempting to separate the act from premeditation. But the state's theory of first-degree murder in Maryland did not live on a confession. It lived on the chain, an internal confrontation in a locked store, a multi-implement assault sourced on site, and a post-incident staging designed to redirect the blame to outsiders. Consciousness of guilt, the footwear theater, the relocated vehicle, the detailed false report stood in for planning. The jury instructions allowed for that path under state law. Deliberation was orderly. When the verdict was read, it made the charging theory official, guilty of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the judge addressed the scale of harm and the constructed nature of the story that followed it. Life without the possibility of parole was imposed. The single ending that the evidence had pointed toward inside the store became the single legal outcome on the record. No second story, no alternate track. The human cost did not require narration to be felt. Jana's name, repeated carefully through the trial for identification, not effect, returned to her family with a measure of clarity that investigations are supposed to deliver. For a community that watched police tape go up on a block known for brunch, yoga, and weekend errands, the message landed in a plain way. Even in quiet corridors, a crime can be built on routine and undone by routine, by the parts of a day that keep the same shape no matter who is telling the story. When the verdict was entered and the sentence made official, the case did not end for the people who worked and lived along Bethesda Avenue. A homicide inside a locked store changes how a community closes up for the night. Managers rewrote end-of-day routines. Two-person lockouts replaced solo closings. Keys and access fobs were audited, signed in and out, and reconciled at the start of every shift. Alarm arming and disarming reports were pulled weekly. Not only when something went wrong, none of this was theater. It was a direct response to a crime that unfolded within a controlled space and then tried to hide behind a story. Loss prevention policies were tightened with a simple principle: accountability in pairs. Bag checks, inventory moves, and after-hours re-entries now required 2 employees and a documented purpose. Stores on the block adopted the same idea, even if their corporate playbooks were different. The goal was to remove private moments where policy disputes could harden into confrontation. A safe retail corridor depends on routine. Investigators used that very fact to solve the case, and businesses used it to prevent the next one. Training changed too. Forensics units in the region folded this file into their instruction on stage scenes. Technicians were taught to collect exemplars from store stock the way they would from a suspect's closet, pulling reference footwear straight from the wall, photographing outsole patterns with a scale, and logging chain of custody as carefully as a seized item. Detectives practiced building a reverse timeline using devices that do not lie: access logs, neighboring cameras, and alarm events. The emphasis was on negative evidence, what should be present in a real invasion but wasn't here, and on documenting those absences as clearly as the physical traces that were present. Neighbor canvassing received an upgrade. Because the Apple Store shared a wall, audio carried farther than sight lines, and that mattered. Patrol officers now include sound witnesses in their first round, people who heard pleading, dragging, or movement patterns even when they never saw a face. Those statements documented early help lock the clock before stories shift. It's a small procedural change with outsized value when a report of masked strangers meets a room that reads as contained. The case also became a cautionary example for interview strategy. Survivor witnesses must be treated with care, and their first accounts preserved exactly as given. But the next step is verification against fixed facts, not repetition. In this file, the room never moved. Doors, drawers, inventory, and vehicles stayed where the evidence put them. Investigators built a habit of lining up each claim with a physical reference, access events, camera views from adjacent businesses, medical examiner findings, and refusing to fill in gaps with speculation. That discipline protects a victim's dignity and protects a case in court. For families, closure is a word that can ring hollow, yet clarity still matters. Jana Murray's name remained anchored to facts, not rumor. Memorials emphasized the life she lived rather than the details of her death. The legal outcome did what the evidence demanded and nothing more. It recorded responsibility in the only place that counts after a homicide, on the public record. Communities heal faster when investigators and prosecutors speak plainly and avoid two competing narratives. This one had one ending, and that consistency helped the neighborhood move forward. Media handling earned its own lesson. Early press interest was intense because the initial story suggested strangers jumping a retail worker and vanishing. The record told a different story. Going forward, agencies on the corridor agreed to push only what the room and the logs could support. No dramatizations of unseen intruders, no speculation about motives until charging decisions were filed. That restraint prevents amplifying a false frame and keeps public focus where it belongs, on verifiable facts. There was a quieter, human recalibration among staff who had worked with both women. Supervisors created clearer channels to escalate loss prevention concerns without confrontation. HR check-ins after difficult shifts became normal instead of exceptional. The point was not to turn a store into a precinct. It was to make sure that employees had a structured way to raise issues before they became flashpoints. In towns built on routine, prevention looks like paperwork. Here, paperwork was the tool that caught a lie and next time might stop a fight before it starts. The case file now sits on shelves where detectives teach new investigators how to spot a scene that argues with the story told about it. It is used to show why undisturbed entry points, in-store implements, and a moved vehicle mean something specific when they appear together. It is used to show why a victim's pattern of life, reliable, organized, forward-looking, matters when their device goes silent inside a locked building. And it is used to remind everyone involved that the fastest way to the truth is still the simplest. Do not argue with the room. The courtroom made official what the store had already said. This was a contained, staged event inside Lululemon on Bethesda Avenue. Prosecutors walked jurors through fixed facts, locked entry points, high-value items left behind, implements sourced from inside the store, footwear impressions consistent with stock on the wall. The victim's car moved only a short distance with keys tied to the surviving coworker, and the medical examiner's findings that undercut any claim of outside attackers. The narrative of masked intruders collapsed under records that do not change. The verdict was clear. Brittany Norwood was found guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Jana Murray, and later that month in 2012, received life without the possibility of parole. Appeals failed to unsettle the evidence. For Jana's family, the ruling put responsibility on the record. For the block, it turned a cautionary lesson into policy, paired closings, tighter key and alarm control, and early, disciplined verification of any story against doors, logs, and neighboring cameras. In a quiet corridor, routine exposed the lie and resolved the crime. When I look back on this crime, what stays with me is not only the brutality of what happened, but the quiet warnings it leaves for all of us. Violence can erupt even in places we trust most, and the cost of ignoring early red flags can be devastating. For me, this case is a reminder to speak up when something feels wrong, to look out for each other at work, and to remember that accountability is never optional. So I want to ask you, what lessons do you take from this story? Do you see ways this tragedy might shape how we protect one another today? I'd love to hear where you're watching from and how this case resonated with you. If you found this video meaningful, please leave a comment and share your thoughts, or even let me know what city you're tuning in from. And if you want to continue exploring real true crime cases told with care, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story.